The story I have to tell you about political anthropology and politics through history is, of course, a dreadful, blood-filled, depressing tale. In front of you have a leaflet suggesting you go to a film which is suggesting we get rid of cynicism and espouse idealism. In many ways, what I'm going to be lecturing about today is exactly the opposite process, why we've become more and more cynical. It was something I had to explain to my granddaughter Lily in the book I mentioned, Letters to Lily. So if you, and even she is becoming cynical at the age of 8, when I asked her to read out the titles of the letters, just to make sure at least she understood what the titles of the letters to her were when she was aged 7 3/4, she went through them all fine, and then she came to one and she said, "Demo crazy." Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings comes. So, demo crazy is one of the letters to her. Bureaucracy, violence, war. If you're interested in what I say here and would like to hear it in a slightly extended form, then Letters to Lily has further thoughts on civil society, justice, and all these subjects. The first lecture will give you a broad picture. I want to say that if you don't get depressed, if you don't feel that you need to know everything that Machiavelli or Montesquieu or anyone else said at this stage, I'm just trying to give you an overview, a 10-minute course in Western philosophy, just as a background to show that anthropologists are interested in the wider picture, and you need to know something about it, and those of you who are doing SBS will probably get to do this, and those doing anthropology will get it in your second year. So the first one will be very broad brush. The second lecture will look at nationalism and violence in a more specific way, so these will become more specific, feud and war. The third will look at law and dispute settlement, and the fourth will look at the tension between the state and its citizens in terms of bandits, mafia, heretics, and civil society. So let's first of all take a broad brush view, which is summarized in the bottom graph here. Can you hear if I talk like this at the back? Yeah? Okay. So if you take the whole, say, 100,000 years or so of human history, until about 3000 BC, it was, as described by anthropologists, holistic. That means to say everything is mixed together. There is no such thing as politics. There's no such thing as law. There are laws with a capital small L. There's politics with a small p. But there's no institutionalization in economics or anything else. The beginning of states, about 3000 BC or a little earlier, means that you begin to get a separation out of something which the institutions of power, states, are basically that there is someone who is a ruler. Before this, in the old joke, if you said, "Take me to your leader in this world," they would look at you with the same incredulity as you will look at a tourist who comes to Cambridge and say, "Take me to the university," or the centre of the university. There isn't one. So here you could now say, "Take me to your leader," and there is a leader. In China, very early. In Mesopotamia and elsewhere, very early. The first specification of what is implied that is particularly helpful is Aristotle. And I put up the dates here of the main works. Aristotle's Politics is the first overview of how political systems work. And as I say, I've got to deal with each of these major thinkers in about half a minute. So the main point about Aristotle that I'd like to make is that he isolated out politics. He said there was a realm, and that politics comes before everything else. That man is by nature a political animal, is one of his phrases. The state is by nature clearly prior to the family and to the individual. So he puts politics at the heart of his system. And his other great claim to our attention is that he makes a classification of political systems. He says they are good and bad. The good ones are monarchy, aristocracy, the best people, and the polity, which is halfway between other systems. And of the bad kinds, there are three: tyranny, oligarchy, ruled by the rich, and extreme democracy. If you ever hear George Bush or anyone else saying that, oh well, we must go back to Greek democracy, remember that Aristotle hated democracy. He thought it was one of the worst possible forms of rule. Democracy is the rule of the poor. Democrats take equality for their motto. Of democracies there are four kinds. The worst, extreme democracy, is that in which all offices are open to all and the will of the people overrides all law. He was, in many modern terms, reactionary and was feared democracy, which will come up again later. Anyway, his politics, which I read as an undergraduate, is just worth reading as a first sketch of what the institutionalization of politics can mean. I'm going to make a big leap now. Aristotle is very, very influential. In this period, you're beginning to get the jointed politics and religion have been separated out from economics and society. So, but they haven't been separated from each other. So in this period, which is the Christian era, the Islamic era, I'm mainly dealing with Western Europe, as you see the political philosophers here, dead white European males, as they're known, duens. I'm not dealing with Chinese or Indian philosophy or anything else. But leaping across here, the next great revolution, that's the first revolution, the separation out of politics. The next one is the separation of politics from religion. As you know, it has not been separated, but as all this fuss that's going on at the moment with the Danish cartoons that some of you may have heard about. But conceptually, in the West, from the time of the Renaissance, and I'll go into this in a little more detail, there are key thinkers who began to separate out. It wasn't just that politics was separated, it should be separated from religion. And the key thinkers start with Machiavelli. Machiavelli is the prince of 1513. Basically says that politics has nothing to do with ethics or religion. If men were entirely good, he says, assume the worst of human nature, assume that people are driven by the worst possible motives. If men were entirely good, this precept would not hold, but because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to observe it with them. But he advises the prince to distrust his subjects and to rule them by fear and trickery. For if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which looks like virtue, if followed, would be his ruin, while something else which looks like vice, yet followed, brings him security and prosperity. So basically, you need to be entirely cynical about the world, and you may end up doing something better than someone who starts with high ideals and religious motivations. Now, this is maybe shocking to you, I don't know, but that is why you have the adjective Machiavellian. And from Machiavelli's time until the present, we've lived in a world which has largely been based on that cynical premise about the worst of human nature, certainly in the West. It leads to terrible tragedies because it assumes the worst of your enemies, and therefore Machiavelli suggested the use of the preemptive strike against enemies. Attack them before they attack you, assume the worst of their motives. So we lived until around 1990 in a Machiavellian world. For 10 years we seem to have escaped from it, and we're back now in the same sort of world. Anyway, he separated out politics from religion in that way. And the next great thinker who did the same thing is Thomas Hobbes. in Leviathan. Basically, his premise is that if you leave people on their own as individuals, they will kill each other. We are a very competitive and aggressive species, and the original state of human societies is one, in his most famous phrase, of no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which is the life of most human beings who've lived on this planet. The condition of man is a condition of war, of everyone against everyone. This is, as Marshall Salin says, the Hobbesian vision of humans is in the natural state is almost the origin myth of Western capitalism. That is the premise of both the political system and the economic system. We are competing against each other, and of course Hobbes' solution to this was Leviathan, the state, which wasn't good, wasn't desirable, but it was better than the alternative, which was nasty, brutish and short. Why I in the end came to like Hobbes is that he said that in the end each of you has the right to life and the pursuit of your own aims, and if the state tells you to forego that, you have the right of rebellion. So inside it there is a liberal doctrine, but on the surface it looks like a very tyrannical kind of point of view. But it's nothing to do with God. God is completely absent. Hobbes was probably an atheist. There's no justification of an ideal or religious kind there. The next landmark is John Locke in the Treatise on Government, about 1689. And here this political sphere has been demarcated even more. It's nothing to do with ethics or religion. It's to do with providing individuals with liberty and, above all, rights to property. The end of law, he says, is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. And the great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Every man, he says, is born with a double right. First, a right to freedom to his person. Secondly, a right before any other man to inherit with his brother his father's goods. Men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal and independent, no one can put them out of his estate without his own consent. You can see how this kind of language got incorporated into the American Declaration of Independence and the rights of man. Basically, rather like Hobbes, he believes that we have a contract. We are not born unequal. We don't have an obligation to the state or anything else. If the state behaves well towards us, then we should obey the state. It's, as I mentioned in previous lectures, rather like the family, that if our parents are nice to us and look after us when we're young, we have an obligation to them. And it's the same with the state. So it's a contractual viewpoint, which is appropriate at the time of the limiting of the power of the monarchy in England. The next major figure is Montesquieu, the spirit of the laws. What Montesquieu does in that amazing book is really to work out the mechanisms for a balanced political system. He was above all interested in liberty, and he made a kind of blueprint of how a free, open, balanced constitutional system will work, the separation of powers, the separation of the judiciary from the executive and so on. And just as Adam Smith made the blueprint for capitalism, Montesquieu gave the blueprint for modern democracy, and his work, along with Locke's, was the basis for the American Constitution. But it's nothing to do with God or religion or ideals. It's just a machine for ensuring personal liberty. So that you get, by this time of the American Revolution, the American Declaration of Independence, which starts, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, 200 years ago, before that, or in any other civilization on Earth at that time, or in any of history, this would have been seen as one of the most preposterous statements ever made. As I point out to my granddaughter, no one, 99% of human beings in history would have thought that these truths are not self-evident, that people are not created equal, they're created unequal. I've talked about this elsewhere earlier. But this premise became more or less very widely accepted in England, America, and is now part of humankind's endeavour. Then came the French Revolution, the disaster, the guillotine. It all ended in blood. And you get a reaction. You get the reaction of Edmund Burke's Reflections on Revolution, which is a marvellous book on the dangers of democracy. You get people going in two directions. Rousseau, in his Social Contract, foreshadows communism and fascism. I used to love Rousseau, and then I read Rousseau more carefully and began to realise that what he was suggesting was a world of Pol Pot. The general will, he suggests that each of us should forego our individual personality and put it into a pool, because we could trust our rulers, trust in them. The general will, give up your individual will to the general will, to Big Brother, and everything will be fine. He is a very totalitarian thinker, although there are many wonderful things in him as well. And another questioning of this direction came in de Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America, and perhaps the greatest of all political thinkers, to my mind, Tocqueville. And his basic suggestion was rather different. He looked at democracy carefully. He loved it in many ways. He was a lover of freedom. But in the end, he became terribly worried as to where democracy would lead, because he thought that the atomization that it created, everyone equal, no bonds between people, a kind of dust, we would all be dust, individual dust, would lead into the world that George Orwell portrays. I was going to read you a passage from Tocqueville, but there, have a look at it yourself if you're interested. He portrays the world of Big Brother absolutely beautifully. So he foresaw, he's the one great prophet, political philosopher prophet, he foresaw everything that's happened in America, and most of what's happened in America now and in the West, very clearly. So have a look at him. Then you get another romantic reaction, rather like Rousseau, and that's Marx's reaction. Basically that if only we could abolish all the individual property, the state system, the class system, go back to that holistic world of tribalism, then everything would be fine. Very idealistic, very religious in many ways. But we now know, looking back over the 20th century, it doesn't seem to work. It's got, we would love it to work, but if you look at China, if you look at Russia, if you look at communist systems, it didn't work for reasons which I may come to talk about. By this time, there's a lot known about the political mechanisms of Western civilization, but Montesquieu and others were very interested in what happened in the political systems elsewhere. Montesquieu compared the West to China, Japan, and other civilizations. But in the later 19th century, when sociology is reborn in the work of Durkheim, Weber, Marx, and Sir Henry Maine, there's more attempt, although Durkheim doesn't pursue as much, there's much more attempt to try and understand how political systems in other civilizations work. And I'll just draw your attention to two examples of this. One is Sir Henry Maine, who I'll be talking about more, who was Master of Trinity Hall here, wrote a book called Ancient Law, which the central feature of this is a binary division between societies, most of the societies in history, which are based on birth, on what he calls status, and societies which are based on the agreement of individuals, what he calls contract. And he thinks that modern progressive, as he calls them, societies, that the movement of progressive societies is from status to contract. That's his famous phrase. It's an oversimplification, but it's a big binary division. Marx didn't like it because he said it was plagiarism, and he'd taken the idea from Marx, or Engels said that. And it is very similar to Marx in some ways, and written about the same time. But it's basically it was based on his ideas and experience in India, where he worked for some years. So India, China, most of the world and most of human history was based on birth and status relations. Modern societies were based on contractual relations. So this was the great, one of the great contributions. The other is Max Weber's contribution. It's summarized in an essay on politics as a vocation from Max Weber, edited by Girth and Mills, where he makes the famous distinctions between three kinds of authority into which you can fit most civilizations. Three political systems. Traditional systems where you do things because you've always done them and you don't question authority. And this covers much of history. Charismatic. Charisma is the coming down of the spirit. Someone suddenly feels that they have the spirit in them and they can tell people what to do, and this often leads to revolutions and big shifts. It doesn't last very long because it usually gives way into the third system, which is the bureaucratic and rational organizational world, which he foresaw would take over the world. The secularization, everything would be on paper, the rules would be worked out. And of course he both saw this as a good thing, better in some ways than what had gone before, but also leading people into an increasingly bureaucratic, rational, dead, disenchanted, cold, icy, as he put it, and in his famous phrase, iron cage. So, luckily he's been proved wrong. We aren't in an iron cage at all. We live in enchanted worlds and full of all sorts of peculiar things. But that was his famous distinction between these three kinds of authority. Incidentally, I should have said that if any of the definitions, like the state or charisma, you want to check this out, the handout that I mentioned at the beginning of the lectures, which has got lots of definitions. Many of the definitions I'm using are on that handout, which you can print out from the web, as you know. The same idea, and that's as far as I go, occurs with law. It starts off, you have laws with a small l in these simpler societies. Gradually law gets separated out from other parts of life, institutionalized, disembedded. And then at the end it gets separated out. So by the time of Montesquieu, the executive and the legislature have to be entirely separate. One of the great ruling beliefs, ideologies of the West is that law and politics are separable and should be separate. In practice, of course, it's very difficult to do that, but that is what people are often aiming at. Now, I want to go on to the anthropological contribution to all this. What happened in the 20th century was that when anthropologists went and did fieldwork particularly in Africa and elsewhere, they found that all this whole raft of political philosophy of the West didn't seem to be very helpful in what they were doing. The famous pronouncement of this is at the beginning of African political systems by Evans Pritchard and Porges. And he says, they say, "We have not found that theories of political philosophers have helped us to understand the societies we have studied, and we consider them of little scientific value. But their conclusions are seldom formulated in terms of observed behaviour or capable of being tested by this criterion. Political philosophy chiefly concerned itself with how men ought to live and what form of government they ought to have, rather than with what are their political habits and institutions." Now, this is a wonderful sleight of hand. it's not true. I mean, many of these Montesquieu's and so on had plenty of empirical evidence. But it suddenly cleared away the decks so that you could have a book which was very, very influential, African political systems. And they were sort of right, because they went back to this world, the holistic world, where you didn't have states and where you didn't have the separations. And therefore all this political philosophy up here, which is to dealing with state systems, wasn't very helpful for them. It's fine for state systems. So in that book, the African Political Systems, the main finding of that book is really based on Sir Henry Maine. Maine had made a temporal distinction between societies based on status and birth, and later societies, modern progressive societies based on contract. They made a lateral one. They said parts of Africa are what they call Group A, which consists of those societies which have centralized authority, administrative machinery and judicial institutions, in other words states, like the Zulu and so on. And then Group B consists of those societies which lack centralized authority, administrative machinery, in short, which lack government. And the Nua, the famous Nua of Evans Pritchard's writing, and the Talensi of Fortes are examples of that. So their contribution was to show how societies which were not amenable to Western political philosophy and which were not subject to the laws here worked. And the contribution of anthropology through the 20th century was to show how basically societies without a head, which are known as acephalous, I just speak for without a head, how these societies work. For example, hunters and gatherers, you don't have a leader in a hunter-gatherer band. They're usually nomadic, usually egalitarian, politics is informal. There are no leaders. There may be an informal head person. For example, the Kung, the famous Kung, whose name I've written up, have a very weak headman. He is generally held responsible for the way a band makes use of its food resources, copes with quarrels. His consent is necessary for an outsider to be admitted to the band. But there's something there. There's just someone who has a little more respect than other people, but he has no power. That's roughly how the Department of Social Anthropology in Cambridge works, having been head of it. You have no power at all. You can't sack anyone, you can't appoint anyone. Everything is done. You just try and lead your band by being cajoling, nice to them, leading from the front. But that's it. There's no instituted authority really, or very little. That's how hunter-gatherer groups roughly work. In cases like the Hadza, H-A-D-Z-A, described by Woodburn, there is minimal politics. Consensus rules, ostracism. If you don't like what you're being told to do, you clear off, you go and join another band. It gets a little more complex and institutionalized with societies which are now living off food which they produce, that is pastoralists and horticulturalists. And one of the great contributions to political theory was the ideas of Evans Pritchard in relation to the Nua and Paul Bohannon on the Tiv. What they basically showed was that in a society which has no state, you can still have a great deal of order, ordered anarchy as it's sometimes called, by a peculiar mechanism which was very counterintuitive at the time. I remember, I knew Evans Pritchard, and he told me about the story of how when he came back from his fieldwork among the Nua, he gave a seminar, a non-novice seminar on his findings, and no one would believe him. They said, it can't work like that. You can't have segmentary groups. Do you remember, or in case you don't know, they sometimes thought that it was based on Evans Pritchard's experience in the army, because the structure he gives, a segmentary structure like this, that's what segmentation means, is that you get a tribe up here, and then you get clans, and then you get sub-clans, and then you get sub-sub-clans, and so on. And the way it works, there is no leader. But the way it works is through oppositions. It's held together by hate, rather like Mr. and Mrs. Pugh in Underwood Wood, if any of you know that book. It's not held together by love. It's held like the world was by mutually assured destruction, communism and capitalism. Hate is just as powerful a way of holding people together as love, and also by authorities. So basically how it worked was that you wouldn't attack these people. This lot here, say they were next to these and quarreling about cows or something, they wouldn't attack these people because they know that these people would then get the support of these people, although they would also get the support of them. So you have a constant feuding, as I'll describe it in more detail next time, a constant standoff through mutual opposition. So segmentation produces a balance of powers, which is roughly how the world political system worked until the United Nations, or the League of Nations, through nation states acting like this and refraining from other nation states through coalitions, leagues, and so on. There is no, as there still is not in the world, a world government. And so we are, in a sense, in a newer state, but with nation states rather than individuals. This was Evans Pritchard's model and a great breakthrough. But in horticultural societies, these are pastoral societies, and that's how they usually work. In horticultural societies, you get another pattern, which is the one of big men. The film I'll show in the film series of Andrew Strathairn's Onker's Big Mocker is an example of that. Basically, someone, as I've explained in the economics lectures, temporarily builds up a reserve or a certain amount of wealth and distributes it. And so through gifts, exchange, arguing, and so on, you get big men temporarily, but you don't get instituted authorities. And this is the world to a large extent that Malinowski describes as well. Through mobilizing a combination of kinship and tribute and redistribution of wealth, you get a political balance. Then you get the development of states, literacy, bureaucracy, taxation, and different kinds of state systems. I think at that point I'll just give you a little break, which I usually do after about 40 minutes, and just show you a little bit more of my website before we finish off. I've had to go through this quite fast, and I ought to, just to encourage you to come to the other lectures. The other ones will be more concrete. This is fairly abstract, but I'm trying to. It seemed to me that it would be very useful if you had a very global overview of political theory and political systems before we go down to the details. Now, the anthropologists who speculated on political theory, there are a lot of them. Unfortunately, I never managed to interview Evans Pritchard, but I have interviewed about 60 anthropologists and sociologists and historians about their life and work, and several of them are key figures in political anthropology. So I'll just show you another little bit where, if you have the interest and leisure to go to, you'll find interviews with anthropologists. If you go to interviews, films of anthropology and other ancestors, you'll find here interviews lasting between 20 and 2 minutes and 2 hours of many of the leading figures who, certainly if you're anthropologists, have been reading about: Tambaya, Leach, Fortes, Goody, so on and so on. And there are some sociologists as well, Michael Mann, for instance, Peter Burke, who's on the fringes of anthropology and history, and so on. And I'll just show you just the way it works and one example. Probably the most famous of the people here is Clifford Geertz, who might branch across your two disciplines. So if you go to the G's here, that's Ernest Gilner talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance. Or Jack Goody there, or whatever. But anyway, here's Geertz.
We need to be much more self-reflexive about what we're doing. We don't, there is no, again, this comes back about my literary background. In literature, there's a whole secondary literature about the way in which novels are made. People talk about how Faulkner writes his novels, how Hemingway's are put together, what George Eliot is all about in print, not in terms of what their psychology is, but how they write. There's almost none of that in anthropology. There's begun to be a little, and my book is one example, and the other is some of them. And there's been a little bit of others, but it still has yet to set in. Almost all book reviews say, have very little to say about how books are constructed, how the argument is made, how the language is what, there's nothing, it's not that the kind of reflection that literary criticism does for literature is absent. No, it's not totally absent, but it's down there. And I think if we want, people always ask me methodological questions, and they want them answered in the wrong way. If we understand how, and this is really point of the book, how are you supposed to put the text together? How are you supposed to put the text together? How then put it? Whether I'm right or wrong, the literary criticism too is is constantly, people argue all the time about whose interpretation of it.
So, in each case, there's 3 or 4 minutes, people talking, just to give you a feeling of whether this is going to be interesting. Then, if you want to see the whole film in your own time, you go to download. This takes you to Digital Space in Cambridge, the new electronic library. And if you press View Open to obviously the longer thing here, in a minute or two it should come down like that, and I won't wait, it's going to take 1 more minute, but basically you have it and you can put it on a CD-ROM and send it to your friends and so on. I'm now getting letters from around, or emails around the world saying, why isn't it working? Because yesterday DSpace collapsed, but it should be working most of the time, and you can just have a look at one of these people whose books you're reading and hear them talking about their work. Unfortunately, you have to go back. There's no back thing. It's a separate page. We'll have to do that. If you we'll go to another person. We go to Edmund Leach.
And you may always have a bent to anthropology, but I think you became a professional anthropologist by a rather slow disease, didn't you? You read something else that said,
well, yes, it was an accident. When I was at Cambridge, I came up to read mathematics and went on to read engineering, and I think I did.
Now, if you go to Fast Start, what should happen is what is happening. The video should start straight away, and you can just watch it. But the important thing about this is that this is Edmund Leach's house in Everston, or wherever it was, Great Cranston. You've got a précis down the right-hand side, so you can see which bit of the film you really want to go to, if you're interested in just a part of his life, or print that out, or whatever.
Well, yes, it was an accident.
So it comes up quite quickly, as you see. You can just watch a bit of it. Any suggestions for people who would like on this thing, let me know. I usually just catch people who happen to be coming from Cambridge or I happen to meet of an elderly kind and who I've heard of. But if there's anyone in particular, I plan to try and get Tony Higgins, Fellow King, so I know. But basically it's people on the borderline. Another interesting person is Peter Worsley, who invented, or at least brought the phrase the third world into English, the English language, took it from the French thinker. He's a great Marxist, he wrote The Trumpet Shall Sound and so on. So, and if you're interested in seeing the sort of era of the Malinowski era, the talk by, beginning of the talk by Audrey Richards as a woman anthropologist in Africa in 1956 is rather charming. So if you're reading a book of one of these people and you want to see, you could just see, in fact if you just type in their name in Google, it'll probably take you to this, because it's often the place that you go to in Google, but many of these people haven't been recorded in any way. Right, so just to finish in the last few minutes, the anthropologists had discovered that this whole large period of political philosophy didn't entirely help them to understand political systems. So they set about generating a number of different kinds of model to understand political systems. And very briefly, the four main periods or ways of looking at politics are the traditional structural functional view, which is the one that I described in relation to Evans, Pritchard and Fortis. You look at a political system like a machine, like a bicycle. That is what structural functionalism and functionalism is about. Looking at society as a machine. It's rather like Durkheim. It comes out of Durkheim. And then you see how feuding or any other political systems work and balance, and the balance of forces and powers. It's often criticised, as you know, as a rather static equilibrium model. It was also clearly of its time, in the sense that it was a time when the British Empire was holding on to an empire rather than expanding in Africa and elsewhere, and those who needed to hold on to or administer this empire were very eager to find out how they could deal with the groups of people who lived on the peripheries of the empire, whether it was in India or Africa or elsewhere. And anthropologists, although they weren't government servants usually, they were working on the edges, as Evans Pritchard was and others, where they went and tried to find out how societies which didn't appear to have a state could be understood and maybe integrated into the empire. One of the people who was brought up in that equilibrium models but then reacted against it was Edmund Leach, and in his Political Systems of Highland Burma, published in 1954, he argued that Kachin Burma couldn't be understood, or the Kachin in Burma couldn't be understood in terms of the older models of Evans Pritchard and others as a tribe. It wasn't a tribe, it wasn't bounded. They weren't the Kachin, they were pervious to other things. Nor was it static, it changed over time. So he developed what you might call a pendulum model, that he went backwards and forwards. He looked at the history of the Kachin, and he found that there were two entirely different political systems. An egalitarian system where everyone believed everyone was equal, and this was known as Gumlao, G-U-M-L-A-O, and a more hierarchical form where you had chiefs and stratification known as Gumsa, G-U-M-S-A, in which local leaders tried to consolidate power into little chiefdoms. It was an oscillation back and forth, very similar to some of the models that were developed by the great Islamic thinker Ibn Khaldun, that's K-H-A-L-D-U-N, in the 13th century, that you went from tribal equality to hierarchies and inequalities in the cities, and then it went back. Khaldoon cycle was about 3 generations. Leach's was much more frequent. And it was a great excitement and change that occurred as a result of his work, because you saw political change occurring. The defect of the idea, to my mind, is that it's a pendulum. You never fly off. You get A to B, B to A to B. And therefore what has happened in many societies, which is A to B to C to D, is not really dealt with. It's still quite static, but at least there's a backwards and forwards. The next sort of big change in paradigm occurs in the 50s and 60s with the work particularly of Frederick Barth, B-A-R-T-H, and he's one of the people who's interviewed on this website I mentioned if you want to see him talking about it last year. His political leadership among the SWAT Pathans describes a world of individual strategizing. Individual Pathan chiefs competed with each other to secure followers and optimize their positions. Basically, what he began to see was that politics is a game. He used this was a time when game theory in economics was very fashionable and it was spreading out. And so he began to analyze political disputes at the local level in terms of a sort of game. You would have an arena, you'd have an area in which you competed for the game, you'd have factions, you'd have teams, you'd have cheating, you'd have rules. Everyone is trying to maximize. And it's a much more dynamic system, and it can be applied not only in remote areas like the SWAT Pathans, but to a Cambridge faculty or a British politics or anything else. Sport games the analogy, and the person who made this popular was F.G. Bailey, particularly in his book Strategies and Spoils, which is sort of taken much from Barth and also from his own experience of watching Indian local politics at work. This was individualized approach, and the last approach that I'll mention here is a reaction against that, particularly in the early work of Abner Cohn in his book Two-Dimensional Man, published in 1974. What he basically says is this is two-dimensional, that is TWO, and also two-dimensional. That is to say, it's all about power. Leach always believed that we were driven by power and the lust for power. He was a politician, I knew him quite well, and he was always, as Provost of Kings and so on, he was believed in a Hobbesian world of power competition. What Cohen says it basically was that no, we're driven by symbols, we're driven by ideas, we're driven by religion, we're driven by those sorts of things. And so in the 70s and 80s, a lot of work was done on how you control people through language. Maurice Bloch, B-L-O-C-H,